If you've studied the problem of evil, you're probably familiar with the basics. And within the Christian tradition, that means that the problem of evil is focused on resolving what appears to be an inconsistent triad, namely that there are three ideas which seem like they all can't be true, right? Only two of them can be true at any given time. And those are that God is all powerful, God is good, and that there's evil and suffering in the world. Then from there, usually there's a division of evil into moral and natural evil, with natural evil being things like earthquakes and hurricanes and tornadoes and things like that, and moral evil being all the terrible things that human beings do to one another. Now, if in the discussion of moral evil, there are specific examples given, one of the examples that occurs is the Holocaust. Now, oftentimes, specific historical examples won't be given at all. But when philosophers of religion want to invoke something from history which reminds us of just how terrible people can be to one another, the Holocaust is usually the event that they reference. Now, this makes sense on two fronts. One, the Holocaust is obviously an example of one of the worst atrocities that human beings have ever committed in all of history. And given the wealth of media, of photographs and film clips and audio recordings from this time period, it's still sort of present to our political and ethical imagination in a way that other events might not be. And also, many of the philosophers who are very influential within the field of philosophy of religion and with a focus on the problem of evil are people who either themselves lived through the Second World War or are the children of people who lived through the Second World War. And so, just in terms of sort of historical distance, those events remain quite close. But it struck me recently that when reading arguments about the problem of evil, that another example of a atrocity from history almost never occurs, and that's slavery. And so it struck me that seems kind of weird. This is also a horrible thing that happened in history. It seems like it would be the kind of thing that philosophers of religion might mention. So then I just thought, well, maybe it's my memory. I just don't remember the instances of people talking about slavery. So I checked. I went and got all my books on the problem of evil and, philosophy of religion textbooks down and looked to check to see, do people talk about slavery? Now, occasionally people do. And when slavery occurs in these contexts, usually it's part of a list. So you'll see someone is talking about moral evil, and then they will list off examples of that moral evil, and they'll say things like hunger and poverty and slavery. Now, that's obviously slavery in general. It's not clear if people are referencing the Transatlantic Slave Trade, but so there is some reference to slavery occasionally, but it is very, very rare. Much less common than references to the Holocaust. And so then I thought, well, maybe it's just the books that I have on my shelf. It could be something that's talked about in more recent work. So I went and spent some time looking around on the internet, looking at the indexes of other books on philosophy of religion and the problem of evil, and still I found that there are almost no references to slavery. Then I thought, well, maybe people aren't talking about slavery, but maybe they discuss racism. And I found that there were even fewer references to racism than there are to slavery, which then got me thinking. I wondered, well, maybe people talk about anti-Semitism since they talk about the Holocaust. And I was surprised to find that though the Holocaust is referenced in work on the problem of evil, there's very rarely reference to anti-Semitism. So all of this got me thinking, and it made me come to sort of two questions that I'd like to explore. The first is, why is it that slavery isn't part of our philosophical imagination when we're talking about evil and suffering? It is one of the worst things that has happened in human history. We can talk about the transatlantic slave trade as an event with a more or less clear start period and end period. So why is it that slavery doesn't appear and work on the problem of evil, especially given that lots of the people who work on the problem of evil are Americans? Why is it that slavery isn't present in their thinking about evil and suffering? And the second is a question about why it is that we tend to think about evil and suffering in terms of discrete historical events rather than the underlying ideas and motivations that are present that cause those events. Why is it that the Holocaust is separated from anti-Semitism and slavery, in the rare instances where it is referenced, is separated from anti-Black racism? And I think this is important because the Holocaust is not the only instance of anti-Semitic violence in European history. In fact, the history of Europe is a history of anti-Semitic violence. Jews have been scapegoated, they have been singled out as religious others, and have been persecuted in absolutely horrific fashion for centuries. And by focusing on only the Holocaust, which, to be clear, is something that people who work on the problem of evil should be addressing, but by separating it from a longer history of anti-Semitism, it becomes possible to think of the Holocaust as just this one historical event, this one instance of almost unimaginable evil, rather than part of a history of evil. And likewise, when we think about the transatlantic slave trade as sort of a historical event rather than part of a history of anti-Black racism, it might be tempting to ignore the ways that racism continues today. And I think that if we are going to work in the area of the problem of evil, if we are going to take those questions seriously, then we need to be developing theories that are capable of responding not only to the Holocaust and slavery as historical events, but to the anti-Semitism and anti-Black racism, which continue to be all too real in the world today.